Welcome back to Left Hand, everyone. This is Sereptie. Today, Emma takes the lead on a conversation we'd been mulling for several weeks, a deep dive into the politics and cultural history of progressive rock, a topic that sits right at the intersection of everything we love to think about on this show. But before we begin, a couple of quick announcements. Vintagia is back. By popular demand, we are doing a second run of Vintagia, I Ching Oracle for Psychogeography and Creative Discovery. The pre-sale is live for 6 weeks only, and surplus will be limited. So head to the link that I have put in the show notes. Also, AHRC Summer School is happening. It starts next week. We have an incredible lineup of courses this summer covering everything from Fanon to anti-civilization to the obsolescence of the human. Courses are quite affordable. There are even scholarships available in the week run-up to each course. Full details are at acidhorizonresearchcommons.com, also in the show notes. Now, Emma and I are joined by Dave Mandl, writer, bassist, WFMU radio DJ, photographer, software developer, and proud anti-authoritarian lefty. We get into the origins of Prog, its politics, its reputation for elitism, and a whole lot more. Okay, let's listen.
Hello and welcome to Left Hand. This is Emma Stam. Today, I'm joined by Sereptie and our guest, Dave Mandl. Dave Mandl writes about music, books, technology, and politics. These days, mostly for The Wire and the Los Angeles Review of Books. He was a longtime editor at the Brooklyn Rail and at Semiotext Autonomedia. He plays bass guitar in a bunch of groups. He's been a radio DJ and producer at WFMU for years. He is also a photographer, and for a living, he is a software developer. On top of that, he describes himself as a proud anti-authoritarian lefty who is deeply interested in linguistics. Very much a Renaissance man. Dave has a new book of photography called Elevated Landscapes, and you can learn more about that and all the different things that he does at his website, davidmandl.com. That's M-A-N-D-L. There's no E in the last name, I noticed. 3 consonants in a row. So quite a lot to introduce with this particular guest. And I'll mention that I have been a longtime fan of Dave's radio show at WFMU. And that's how I found him online and realized that he would be an excellent person to talk to about prog rock, which is the topic of today's episode. And we're going to try to make some connections between prog music and the different things that we address on this podcast: philosophy, theory, politics, social issues. So with that, welcome to Left Hand, Dave.
Thanks for the kind introduction.
So I thought we could start by having you give a brief introduction to the genre of prog, describing its defining characteristics and situating it in popular music history.
Sure. Always a little difficult, but I'll take my best shot at it because I have to do it often, as hard as it is. So at some point, the roots of prog rock or progressive rock, I'd say, are early 70s, pretty much. And basically coming out of the 60s and Sgt. Pepper and various sort of experiments that were starting to happen, musical artists, rock artists were getting more adventurous, trying to break out of the standard blues chord changes and riffs and so on, and explore different areas. So in the late 60s, I guess, if I want to sort of pinpoint it, people were doing more and more adventurous things. There was a term, and these are not at all precise terms, but people started using the term progressive rock to refer to music that kind of broke out of the standard kind of blues mold that rock had been in for years. So it was just a generic term, meaning people who were trying to do something different, music that was rock-based music that was a little more adventurous. Fast forward a little bit to pretty much the early 70s, and there was a movement, mainly, I would say it mainly started in Europe and especially England, where people started introducing, rock bands started introducing so-called classical elements into the music, either incorporating melodies and things from the classics, or more generally kind of aping classical music. That is much more complicated structures, both like macro, in other words, the structure, pieces of music that were much longer, that had many different parts to them instead of just a single verse, chorus, rock and roll thing. And incorporating more classical kinds of things, melodies, non-rock melodies. Some of the English groups, one that comes to mind is King Crimson. They were one of the pioneers of progressive rock. And in interviews, I've seen a couple of founders of King Crimson say that it might maybe sound borderline racist. It absolutely isn't, but they just thought that American music, blues and American blues and this kind of stuff that rock was generally based on wasn't their music. And they started exploring more their tradition, like more European music and specifically European classical music. So they started incorporating more European classical themes into the music. And at a certain point, the term progressive rock started referring to that stuff. So there were certain bands. The big ones early on would have been King Crimson, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Yes, Genesis, maybe Jethro Tull. I mean, it's important. Those are kind of the founding fathers. And progressive rock began to refer to this kind of stuff specifically. So these classical themes and structures, but also equally important, technique, frankly, became more important. And in addition to playing music that was structurally more complicated, the playing became more complex. So again, musicians sort of getting tired of the strictures of rock music and the standard kind of riffs of rock music, started exploring more difficult kinds of things, more difficult kinds of guitar solos and melodies. So the classic progressive rock of the 70s, again, has a sort of classical element to it, but also very, very, very high level of musicianship. Sometimes in fact, showing off. I mean, really, a lot of them just really pushed it. And going along with it, and I think it's kind of relevant, important to mention, is fancy equipment. Like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, as they became really big and really rich, a drummer had this incredibly expensive hand-carved chrome drum kit, and the keyboard players in progressive rock bands started playing like 6 or 7 keyboards. You started seeing these setups. Keith Emerson from Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Rick Wakeman of Yes were the two big ones. Those were the two big keyboard gods of progressive rock. Suddenly these guys had 6, 7, who knows how many keyboards on stage. Now, surely those keyboards were kind of necessary to do what they were doing. An organ, a piano, a harpsichord, a synthesizer, but also there was a bit of an element of showiness to it. So that was sort of classic progressive rock. The term prog, and again, it's hard to pin down, but there are certain groups that surely are progressive rock bands. You know it when you hear it, so to speak. Much, much later, I would say, the term prog came to be used, which of course is just short for progressive rock, but prog was often used to refer to an even narrower slice of progressive rock. So over time, deserved or not, progressive rock got a reputation of having all these elves and fairies and witches, this kind of stuff. And prog generally, and that stuff, sometimes that stuff is often poked fun of. We can get to that at some point. But prog, when people say prog, they're often referring to this really over the top stuff that is just very, very obviously difficult to play and has all these outre, wizards and fairies kinds of things. Rick Wakeman of Yes, again, really an important figure in progressive rock. At some point, he started wearing a cape. I saw a really good interview with him where he talked about many things, including that. And, I don't remember. It probably was just an impulse. I don't think there was anything, any great thought or theory behind it. He just started wearing a cape on stage. So you have this guy playing with very long blonde hair down past his shoulders, playing 16 keyboards, very, very good player, playing really complicated stuff on all these keyboards and wearing a cape, maybe even a sequined cape. So the cape actually became a thing. Like when people talked about progressive rock or prog rock, like, oh yeah, these guys with wearing capes and playing 16 keyboards. So it had this reputation of being very over the top, people playing as many notes as they could, abstruse structures. The lyrics, I'm actually, as probably will become clear, I don't focus as much on lyrics. I just was always more of a music than a lyrics person. But the lyrics were way out there, completely fairy tales and just really overblown lyrics. And that also became part of it. So prog generally had a reputation of being just over the top in every way.
So this morning I was listening to Starless and Bible Black. Crimson is the first band you mentioned, and I think of Crimson as, if we're going to identify an original progressive rock band, they would certainly be a viable candidate. And on Starless and Bible Black, which is probably my favorite Crimson album, there is the track Lament. I think it's the second song. And they directly call out blues music as there's a smugness in that lyric. All the kids who play the blues will learn my licks with a bottleneck slide. Yeah. So, it occurs to me that even in the name of the genre or movement, whether this is correctly understood as a genre or not is maybe something we can talk about, but the word progressive entails moving away from something else. So already in the name, it's defining itself by what it's not. And in your introduction just now, you're anticipating one of my questions, which is about the criticism of prog that says it's elitist and exclusionary, and we can get into what that means in terms of the demographic makeup of both the musicians and the fans. But I want to introduce that question early on in our conversation.
Sure. There's a little or more than a little bit of snobbery. I just want to first address something you said a minute ago about blues. In several contexts, I saw or heard prominent prog people, musicians, and kids I knew who were into prog refer to boogie as like that was just the kind of lowest, like boogie was just this beneath contempt almost. So there was a kind of, I'm probably jumping ahead, but there was a kind of a mind-body split, and not necessarily in a good way. Like, this is music for thinking as opposed to dancing to. So there was definitely a certain amount of snobbery early on, and I think that changed over time, and that's really significant, and we can get back to that. But yeah, there was. I mean, I think among the musicians, they had to, in private, kind of wink at each other like no one can play this kind of music, like we're the best. People like Carl Palmer, the drummer in Emerson, Lake and Palmer, just was like the fastest drummer around. And there was a lot of that. Steve Howe, the guitarist from Yes, just had incredible technique, extremely fast. It's stuff that was impossible to play. I mean, I can go on a lot of the big names. That was true of a lot of the big names. And yeah, there was, I think of maybe by way of making excuses or something. I mean, I was thinking about this the other day, and I was thinking of bebop, jazz. The way bebop started was, to oversimplify a little bit, was a bunch of really, really, really crack top jazz musicians saying, okay, we're gonna write stuff that nobody can play. None of these pretenders can play. Maybe none of the white guys can play. And that was one of the big impetuses behind bebop. Now, I don't think, there surely must have been some of that with Prog also. Just I don't think it was just to show off or just to separate the men from the boys, so to speak. But the word progressive is important, and it's good that you kind of emphasize that, because to me, one of the biggest elements of prog, and one of the things very generally, very vaguely that appeals to me in it, is the progressive nature. In other words, we're going to push the boundaries. Like we're not going to play the same old stuff. We're going to try something new, and it may fail sometimes. It may be crazy, but it really was about pushing boundaries. And like we're tired of playing that same old crap. And one of the elements of the music that these people invented was this stuff is really hard to play. And that might have been a little bit of like, yeah, but also we want to push ourselves. And that's an element of prog that I think some people, like some musician friends of mine, kind of have trouble with. And I don't really. I mean, I'm a musician, and growing up, I didn't want to play as fast as I possibly could, but I wanted to improve my technique. I wanted to get good and better and better and better. So, there was this element of we just want to push as far as we can. And yeah, there were going to be people who, sorry, man, you're not capable of playing this stuff. But I don't think that was the goal, per se.
Thank you, Dave. When thinking about doing this episode, I was basically doing a bit of personal time travel, trying to think when prog music made the first impression on me. And so I'm a Gen Xer and a child of the 1980s. And the first time that I made contact with progressive rock was probably in like 1981, 1982, sitting in the passenger seat, coming home from like nursery school or kindergarten with my mom. And by this time, we might argue that prog evolved. Progressive rock musicians were already flirting with a pop sensibility by this time. So it wasn't uncommon, for example, to hear on the radio Supertramp, a talented band by every measure, and a song like the Logical Song coming on the radio. And it's interesting that you use the word boogie, because as a very young child, my mother told me, my mother and I loved music growing up. And she said the very first song that I was interested in was Boogie Wonderland when it came on the radio. And I would just start grooving at like 2 or 3 years old. But I have a very distinct memory where, like I said, coming home from nursery school or kindergarten, I heard the Logical Song on the radio, and that just pricked my ear the right way. And although I did not at that time have the capacity to understand the lyrics, I was able to understand that something lyrical was happening that definitely fell outside the sensibility of everything else that was on the radio at that time. And I remember turning to my mom and saying, like, I like this song. What do you think about this song? And she just did not like it. She was more on the boogie side of the fence. And it was, as they say in psychoanalysis, it was a sort of break with the participation mystique of my mother. Like, I finally had a desire that was not hers. And she might have even turned the channel at that time. And it made me think, like, what was that song? What was it all about? And I actually, at that very young age, connected Supertramp with Rush because of the nasally vocals as well. Mm-hmm. There's something affectively just very different about those bands. Mm-hmm. Ironically, the Logical Song, it's a very philosophical tune when you think about it, but also it has to do with the way in which a child's sense of wonder is put under erasure by the social forces that inscribe you within the social order. So right there in the passenger seat, I fell victim to the very thing that Roger Hodgson was talking about in the song. But that sort of brings me to a point, is that very early experience with progressive rock, and then later in my young adult life playing in a prog metal band. And not only that, I would say that my early flirtations with philosophy were very much brought about by listening to Rush and the lyrics of Neil Peart in particular. And so just in that little stew that I've started to stir here, I think the question or the topic that I want to pursue is, I guess you would say, the politics or the proto-politics of prog rock. In particular, what we hear in Supertramp's song, right? This pathos of distance of the individual separating from the group, not wanting to be part of the institution with a capital I. Rush, in particular, the song Free Will. Neil Peart, a known, when in his younger days, a libertarian reading Ayn Rand, and definitely having that be a part of the music. And so there was a very strong libertarian streak in a lot of that progressive rock. And it does connect to this sort of pathos of distance, which is arguably connected with some reactionary politics. Like this is a concept in Nietzsche's work. Nietzsche can be read a number of different ways, but this flight of the individual from the collective mass is one that it's kind of strange. Even though it has aristocratic leanings, it was something that then started to sit more comfortably with the working class later on. And where a working class person could imagine themselves as being a consumer of this high quality, classically infused, aristocratic aesthetic in prog music, but then perhaps be somewhat blinkered to the material conditions of their lives. I know it's a lot more complicated than that, but I think the person who's indoctrinated into prog music or absolutely repelled by it, one of the reasons that comes about is because of the sort of general political character of some of that prog music from the late 70s and early 80s.
Wow, yeah, there's a lot there. As I said, I'm barely qualified to talk about the lyrics, but I had never thought of that, and I'd have to think about it a little bit more. But I don't think Rush, of course, was very political. They were very into Ayn Rand and stuff, and that caused a lot of people to have problems with that. Whatever. But the sort of classic or stereotypical prog lyrics, I don't think were particularly political. What they're best known for is these kind of like fairy cliches, like early King Crimson, the first King Crimson album, which is kind of like almost like the founding manifesto or one of them of Prog. That had all these mystical, you have the Black Queen chants the funeral march, the cracked brass bells will ring to summon back the fire witch to the court of the Crimson King. I mean, like that was this hippie, this crazy mystical hippie stuff that became a cliche when people sort of parodied prog rock. And the other thing that I see most being kind of parodied or singled out in prog is John Anderson of Yes, who has been sort of ridiculed, not always, but sometimes. I mean, I think I've read it. I seem to recall reading interviews with other members of Yes who said, like, I don't know what the heck he was talking about. In and around the lake, mountains come out of the sky. They stand there. What the heck, you know? But the classic for Yes is and really one of the peak prog moments is Tales from Topographic Oceans by Yes in every way. That is like the ultimate prog record, for better and worse. Double album is incredibly abstruse, incredibly dense. It's just, to this day, I don't really know the whole album. It's just like too much, which is saying something. But the lyrics in that album, Tales from Topographic Oceans, famously, there's in the liner notes, he says, there was this book, Autobiography of a Yogi. I forget the yogi. I forget the guy's name. It was very, very popular. All the hippies read this book at the time. And John Anderson says in the liner notes with a totally straight face, I was reading the Autobiography of a Yogi, and there's a footnote on page 38, and I got really lost in that footnote. So this whole album is based on a footnote in this book, Autobiography of a Yogi, and it's all this just incredibly impenetrable mystical stuff.
Right,
and
right.
That is, for better or worse, probably leaning toward worse. That to me is like the typical prog lyrics, set of lyrics. So that kind of stuff. I'd be interested to hear. I can't think offhand of many other more political or philosophical kind of stuff. I'm sure there must have been, but that's the stuff. That's the stuff that is stereotypical. Those things. Also, Genesis is classic Genesis. This would be 70s Genesis. I have to be very clear. They were very funny. They had a great sense of humor, and they wrote all these really goofy songs. The Return of the Giant Hogweed, which is this plant that takes over and eats people and stuff. They wrote really funny stuff that's kind of uncategorizable, but there's no way you would have heard something like that from a straight rock band. As a song called Harold the Barrel, where this guy is sitting on a window ledge somewhere, and everyone around town is saying, this actually is, maybe it does fit in with what you're talking about. Harold the Barrel has always been a favorite of mine. This guy just is just sick of everybody's crap, and he's sitting up on a window ledge, and everyone from town gathers around to try to talk him down, and they're all just a bunch of jerks. So you have like the cop coming along saying, "Man of suspicion, you can't last long. The British public is on our side." And then the reporters come along, and they with camera crews. And then his mother comes along and says, "Harold, come down off that ledge. If your father were alive, he'd be very, very, very upset." And his response is, "You must be joking. Take a running jump." That's his response to all these people. And it's great. And that is this really, really wonderful. It doesn't require, it's really right there on the surface. But to me, it was always a great individualist statement against someone who's just being hounded by all these dopes with their own particular agenda, and just leave me alone. And then there's a bridge in the middle where he just goes off. It gets kind of dreamy, and he says, "If I were many miles from here, I'd be sailing in an open boat on the stream, but instead I'm on this window ledge." It's great.
Well, I think that's exactly it. I think maybe the common thread, and once again, this doesn't fall firmly into the reactionary camp. I think there is a way of thinking about the individual and thinking about individualism that can have like a truly liberatory or even a left-wing accent to it. But the kinds of political tropes or the social criticisms that were embedded in a lot of these songs never attacked capital. Mm-hmm. They often attacked politicians. Mm-hmm. They would attack the media. They would attack the suburban neighborhood. And those are all things that then became targets for the emergent new right of today. And so there's a way in which reactionary politics can sit very comfortably within all that. But once again, there is a hazy overlap there, because I would argue from a left-wing perspective that many of the excesses of capitalism are recapitulated or reproduced by the very culture of the subdivisions, so to speak. And Rush is probably a paradigm case here, because they have a foot in all of these things. They have a foot in Kings and Fairies. I mean, the trees. Mm-hmm. There's also the kind of like scientific element, the Cygnus X1, if you will, the epic album 2112, and the individualistic politics besides.
I want to point out maybe one exception that proves the rule, unless I'm mistaking something or I'm misremembering something. I actually think now that my recent past is coming back to me, that I found you, Dave, on Mastodon through looking for other people who are interested in a particular subgenre of prog called rock in opposition that crystallized in Europe in the 1970s. And the specific features, it's a more avant-garde version of prog, and was definitely never going to go pop. I mean, it started out in a very experimental register, and even though some of the newer Rio bands might be less out there, they're still nowhere near mainstream radio friendly, let's say. But I bring them up because one of the main bands in that movement, Henry Cow, had, I believe, distinctly left-leaning politics.
They were communists outright. I mean, absolutely no question, no apologies. Yeah.
Yeah. One of my favorite figures from popular music history is Dagmar Krause, who was the singer for Henry Cow, and she did a lot on her own. She has a very interesting voice. I've heard her described as Joanna Newsom with a German accent. Very, very distinctive. And I think she did a number of covers of Kurt Weill's music that he wrote for Brecht's plays, which of course is politically unambiguous, left-leaning. So that's a bit of an aside, but I think we can actually keep stirring all of the ingredients in this stew together. So even though, Dave, you've mentioned that you focus more on the music than the lyrics, we've already introduced the topic of fanciful and esoteric references. In the last installation of It's Complicated, you played a track from a band called Egalitarian. I'm probably bungling the pronunciation. It's French. But the song is an homage to a book about the Dogon tribe and their astronomical knowledge, which is just another of countless examples of this drive towards the arcane, the hyper-specific. It's very cerebral, very intellectual. And as we're considering the politics here, it may be, and I think it bears out historically, if you actually look at the lyrics for the definitive bands, that you could say there's something reactionary or at least hyper-individualistic in a way that we might be able to reconcile with leftist politics. Maybe so, maybe not. 2112 is a perfect example of this. And as you were just talking about Russian Ayn Rand, but long story short, these are musicians who are really thinking not just in sounds, but in words and concepts, whether the concepts are subordinate to some sort of overarching aesthetic effect or the rock music of it all. I think that actually depends on the particular band and project. A lot of it is just very, very conceptual, very cerebral in a way that kind of makes it not rock, which is where I think some of the criticism comes in. But something I'm thinking about now is that this is music by and for obsessive people who really want to push something to its utmost limit, whether it's playing music in the most inaccessible of time signatures, creating these multi-part 18-minute long tracks, but also getting very obsessive, neurotic about the lyrical content, whether it's something that they're genuinely interested in intellectually or just they think it's sort of a cool and maybe a decorative sense. It really seems to me that there's a sympathy between prog musicians and prog fans and the kinds of people that we usually talk to and that we ourselves probably are as philosophy and theory people, where you want to take things to the utmost level or to the first principles and really understand systems and structures and just get very refined, maybe. So I could put this question out there to both of you, actually, maybe starting with Dave, which is, if I'm characterizing any of this even remotely correctly, what has that looked like in your own careers as musicians, as people who are both sort of doing the life of the mind thing as well? If prog rock is sort of a crystallization of that, how does this all land for you, both?
Yeah, a lot of good points there. And thank you for bringing up rock in opposition. Really, really important. I was focusing to start on sort of the core, best known, unequivocally prog, progressive rock bands. The RAO bands, rock in opposition, absolutely, I would call most of that stuff prog, although it's a little bit on the edges, but no question a part of that. Rock in opposition was sort of a coalition of bands, mostly European, but there was at least one American group. It was put together by Chris Cutler. Chris Cutler was a drummer in Henry Cow and many other bands. And he's also a writer, a theorist. He's really, really smart, really good writer, very, very left. And Henry Cow, I mean, they were commies. I mean, there's just no question about it. Their lyrics, the graphics on their covers, just everything about them. And the idea of rock in opposition, as the name kind of implies, it was opposition to, which at the time was a pretty radical thing, opposition to the record industry and so on and so on. So this was a coalition of groups, all pretty much had left politics, leftist politics, all really, really good musicians, definitely in the prog tradition. And they played at political rallies and events and so on. In France, there were a lot of, again, prog adjacent bands in France that came out of May 68. So after May 68, there's a whole bunch of groups that emerged from that movement who were very radical. I mean, the one that So a lot of them just kind of disappeared. A lot of them had short lives. There's a group ZNR, who I guess maybe were a rock and opposition group. They were around for longer, and they put out a few records. But again, the French scene and also maybe the Italian scene, a lot of these people were lefties. A lot of these people were activists, and they were very involved in 68, May 68 or 1968 stuff. So that's for sure. I do think it's funny because some people, we talked about this previously offline, but some sort of doctrinaire leftists, sorry to say that, would consider would consider Prog in a lot of ways bourgeois, but and in some ways, yeah, sure, maybe, but also it is about breaking the mold and trying something different. Record companies are not going to like this. People are going to scratch their heads, but let people think a little bit more and let's just incorporate things that have never been done before in rock. Henry Cow, it's just, I mean, they're just uncategorizable. I mean, yeah, sure, I guess they're a rock band, but I mean, some of them were like serious musicians, like classically trained musicians. Dagmar Krause, who we mentioned, comes from, I don't know, maybe more of a music hall, to the Brecht Weil, was into that kind of stuff. There was all kinds of stuff going on, but they present, so to speak, as a rock band, and they were part of the rock world. So it's a totally radical thing to do that for a rock band, to do that kind of stuff. The Art Bears, I have to mention, the Art Bears were kind of a Henry Cow spinoff. Dagmar was the singer in the Art Bears, and Fred Frith and Chris Cutler from Henry Cow. Mainly it was those three. The Art Bears were, there's an album, an Art Bears album called The World as It Is Today. And it's probably the most blatantly left lyrics I've ever seen on an album ever. There's a song called The Song of Investment Capital Overseas. I mean, one after another. It's brutal, absolutely brutal. Bang, 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 bang against capitalism. It's incredible. And that's significant. I mean, there were bands doing that kind of stuff.
My story is a little bit different than maybe some of the other prog rock bands that lean left. In fact, I would say when I started playing in a prog rock band, I was not fully radicalized as a leftist initially, but I was able to, through the idiom of progressive rock and just the sheer capaciousness of the genre to experiment lyrically and musically, allowed me to kind of find my way towards my politics in a way. So that was all happening in the Bush era, up through the Obama eras when we were most active. And I was active in the Occupy movement. And it was around that time that I probably wrote the most lyrically radical things. But I think what's interesting about my case, maybe for the annals of prog rock music, is that I started out in a place that was probably circulating, maybe not necessarily the individualism of that we were talking about earlier, but some of the common themes in prog rock, the kind of social alienation that one feels within suburban white America, just the utter weirdness of it all, not to mention the grating effect that modernity has on the artist. Those things were sort of meta themes in the larger metaphors that I was constructing. But then at some point, once we realized what was happening to our world through the Bush administration and seeing, for example, that Obama was not going to save us, and then emerging out of those left liberal politics, it became apparent to me that lyrically, we could do something that would be interesting, unique, and address these, at least for me as a band member. I was probably the only one who was this way. Other bandmates were kind of on the spectrum, so to speak. They were leftish rather than leftists. And one of the challenging things for me musically was, at that time, progressive rock, maybe not so much progressive metal, but progressive rock, we were epigons of our era. Progressive rock was already behind us. In fact, our musical friends were all kind of coming out of new metal. I worked closely with the band Alien Ant Farm. In fact, our first record was recorded at the bass player's house. And so the kind of scene and situation that I was in had a cultural and collective affect that was quite different from the kind of gravity and seriousness with which I wanted to infuse our band. And in fact, Ty, who's the bass player of Alien Ant Farm, when we were recording lyrics, he kind of challenged some of my lyrical choices. He's like, hey, here, you want to connect to the heartstrings of people. Like, a lot of my stuff was in the head. And so there's this dialectic too, that a progressive musician working with a producer who's grown up in a pop or rock sensibility is going to feel that stuff either as kind of grating or elitist or something else. And so just to your point, Dave, is that this perceived elitism, I'd prefer to look at it as a kind of pathos of distance. There's an affect that stands apart from the way the world is right now. And there's a way in which we can sort of ride that wave to find something new. Because if we're going to build the new world, right, we're going to have to step outside of what we understand as being normal. So, I mean, I think just that sort of encapsulates my experience as a progressive rock musician, and then as somebody who became radicalized, became politicized from the infancy of our band into its later teen and adult years, where it was really, lyrically speaking, fully fledged as a left-wing band.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One way to tie this all together, to tie that stuff all together, is to say that maybe playing prog rock or being immersed in that world of thinking that way musically freed people up lyrically as well, right? I mean, the state of the state of mind of that music is we're just going to push. We're going to try to do stuff that hasn't been done, and we're going to sing about stuff that hasn't been sung about, maybe. So there is an individualist, and I don't mean that in a bad sense, an individualist impulse. And just to buck trends, whatever direction that is. So I think playing that kind of music to a certain degree also frees you to sing about. You're playing weird stuff. You can also sing weird stuff, difficult stuff.
This has brought up a lot of different thoughts for me, and I'm going to put a few things out there. This question of whether prog is bourgeois, even though we've sort of gotten past it, I want to come back to it. I'm thinking about the recent remarks that Timothy Chalamet made about ballet and opera, and this pervasive sense that certain forms of art are, for the upper class, are elitist. And certainly that charge has been leveled at Prog, as we've already stated a few times. But as Sereptie pointed out, there's the sense that in order to build a new world, we're going to need to step outside of the regimes and what the regimes that we're currently in. And what that looks like is not simply an act of mental abstraction, sitting in front of your computer and writing about how capitalism is bad and what a better alternative might be. But there are different ways to embody and enact it, I think. And when I look at a lot of my favorite artworks from the 20th and 21st century, including movements in music, but also literature, there is this fanciful, elfin, magical quality to it that I've always seen as hand in hand with my political commitments. One of my favorite writers is the novelist and short story author Angela Carter, who was fully in fairy tale world and a committed socialist. And she if she saw any conflict there, she never spoke about it. But that's just one example of what I'm getting at here. So it's about bringing a new regime, shall we say, of aesthetic representation into the current order. And somebody we talk about on this podcast constantly is the late cultural theorist Mark Fisher, who has perhaps his most famous theory, this theory of capitalist realism, about what sorts of themes topics, affects, sentiments can really be countenanced under capitalism. That's had a huge impact on my thinking. And I think a lot of people in the community around this podcast would agree with that. But Fisher has an essay that I think is particularly applicable here. In his book, The Weird and the Eerie, he has a chapter on the band The Fall, not a prog band, but he looks at their album Grotesque and uses it as an example of a clash of, the term I just used is regimes of aesthetic representation. On the cover of this album Grotesque, there's this, it's a figure of like a goblin climbing up over a building, and it looks like it's been etched onto another image. So you have two worlds coming into collide with each other. And then there's this song called The North Will Rise Again that is about a figure from an England that never existed. It's like a Victorian sort of flamboyant drag cabaret guy who wants to return to a past that never actually existed against gray modernity and the stultifying effects of industrialism. And it's this dramatization of how this man and this sort of radically aestheticized world that he wants to inhabit really never existed and is not going to exist. And this is analysis by and for a lefty community. And I taught that essay in a course that I taught for the educational platform that's associated with this podcast. And in my lecture about it, I said that this guy in this song seems like a reactionary figure. He could be the QAnon shaman. He could be one of these sort of right-leaning hippie types we see now who are doing a lot of psychedelics and going to Burning Man, but they're radical individualists who can't accept modernity. And I look at some of my favorite albums and songs that would be considered prog, and that reactionary quality is right there. I don't know if either of you are familiar with the band Sleepy Time Gorilla Museum. One of my absolute favorites. Their album of Natural History is like probably a top 3 album of all time for me. And I saw them play in Manhattan last year, which was really wonderful. I've seen projects related to them all over America and Europe. I'm a huge fan. So they have the album of Natural History is sort of a love letter to deep ecology. It's an anti-civilizational album, I would say, in a way. And they have a song specifically about the Unabomber. Mm-hmm. It's called FC, the Freedom Club. Talk about esoteric references in Prague. And I promise, I know that this is a long digression, but I'm going somewhere with this. These guys are not capitalists. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've met them. I've hung out with them. My friend was maid of honor at the wedding of 2 of their members. I actually know them somewhat. But they don't, at least in their creative expressions, fit doctrinaire leftism, to use the term you used, Dave. There is something there that could be considered reactionary. Another one of my favorite bands is Thinking Plague. That's a pretty deep cut from, I think they were on Cuneiform Records.
Yeah.
And there is this anti-civilizational, primitivist, arguably sort of sound, and they're politically very interested in environmentalism and getting away from, again, the effects of industrializing modernity in some sense. And it's almost like these different commitments can be countenanced in art. But if you look at mainstream discourse, especially the way people slice and dice leftism online today, and in the younger generations, I mean, I'm a millennial. I don't think a lot of this is actually accessible even to people. I don't know. I don't want to be mean towards my generation, but I don't know a lot of people my age, and I'm not even that young that I can speak to about this. And certainly like in Gen Z, I feel like there's almost something that's, I can't even communicate about this. So I'm not going to try to turn that into a question. I've just introduced a lot of different things, and yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I didn't know. I mean, I don't know much about that. There's probably not much I can add, but thank you for that. And I'm familiar with those bands, but naturally not very familiar with their lyrics. But that's very interesting about the primitivism. I didn't know about that. Yeah. I mean, I know have been involved many years with various anarchist groups and anarchism, and I know a lot of anarcho-primitivists, so yeah, I'm familiar with that. But I didn't know about Seat Time Gorilla Museum's lyrics. I wasn't even aware of that.
And I mean, they're not going to live like primitivists. I mean, they're living on the grid for sure. There's something about the sound. I mean, the content of the lyrics is as well. They're really, railing against the effects of technology writ large. Are they walking the walk more than that? I mean, that is something that maybe we could talk about. This is all in the realm of the aesthetic, right? Whether they're doing politics towards a left-leaning ethos or something that's more libertarian. If we're channeling our energies this way, maybe the whole thing is bourgeois in a certain sense.
Yeah, or just what kind of conclusion can we draw from it? Where does it fit into the Prog world? How representative is it? Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, I guess it sounds like we can find people of kind of every political stripe, but to vastly oversimplify and vastly overgeneralize, I think this is just more evidence that you can sing about almost anything in this kind of music. I mean, I think that's important. Like, I can't imagine singing about almost any of these themes that we're discussing in like a straight rock or pop framework. It just seems like it almost implies just more like capacious structure, more room to spread out, and less of a straitjacket musically. I mean, they just seem to go hand in hand. But it's hard for me to find a common theme tying these all together. Obviously, they're all over the place, which I guess is good.
Well, Emma, because you brought up Mark Fisher, I think there's something. Oh, we should ask Dave. Dave, have you looked at Mark Fisher's work at all?
You know, that's the answer to that is yes. I've looked at it. I'm not really that familiar with it, to be honest. So I can't say much. But fire away.
There's a particular blog post that he had written that you can find in the K-Punk Reader, where he coins this concept of the egalitarian aristocracy. And I mean, Mark Fisher is known for flirting with the work of Nietzsche in a sort of left-wing way. And I mean, Nietzsche keeps coming back here because of this concept of aristocracy and the pathos of distance. In that particular blog post, he looks at goth culture as being one of these paradoxically egalitarian aristocratic cultures where we come into this world, we're born a certain way, we're in a certain social class, and whatever the strictures of our social class might be, whether that's we come from a working class family or an upper class family or whatever, and we have a right to rebel. And our right to rebel can happen first through aesthetic adornment, through an indulgence of a change in our features and our makeup and so forth. And I think these things can be tied into political projects. I've argued constantly on this podcast that there cannot be socioeconomic change without a fundamental change in the way in which we create our own cultures and maybe even become self-aware of them in some way. And in particular here, we look at, for example, historically, as we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, that prog rock emerged out of a sensibility that wanted to break with American blues and return to classical culture. I think we live right now in such a fragmented assemblage, a gyre of so many cultures, genres, and everything, not to mention that home recording has been democratized. And the ability for us to pick any genre or pick any band as a sort of touchstone or starting point for our work, that pathos of distance is there for all of us. if we're willing to put in the work for prog rock to build our chops up, or to accept that we're going to undertake a musical project that's going to go beyond the bounds of the known. And it's going to involve risks. Even if we go in with a certain set of political ideas or notions, as I did with my own band, life happens. And if you are in a container, and prog rock is quite apt for this, as we said, capacious is this word that we've been using, it gives you this landscape to explore. And you can sort of even reinvent. I mean, how many prog musicians have reinvented themselves and their image within the context of the genre which they created? I mean, Rush in the 1980s would be one example. I also think of Mark King from Level 42, somebody who is able to bring the stars down to earth, as it were, just a fantastic musician and able to create pop songs that everybody enjoyed. And so I think we live in a world now where we're far beyond the so-called elitism of progressive rock. It might not be to everyone's musical tastes, but in line with what Emma was saying is that if we are willing to pursue a rigorous and complex musical project and tie it in with our politics, we can formulate a sound that creates the affect of the ideas that we're trying to promulgate. So I think in that sense, and this is why I have trouble with the old school Marxist bourgeois proletarian distinction. We don't live in that world anymore. I think we have a new set of problems now. And there's a lot more at our fingertips that was once high and above and out of sight or out of reach, if you will. And I think we need to acknowledge that and acknowledge that we have creative capacities within this bricolage of culture that we live within right now.
I agree. I think that, it's not black and white. And a lot of the criticism of prog treats it as a black and white thing. I am a fan of all kinds of, not musically, but sort of theoretically, politically, all kinds of hybrids. I mean, I come from an anarchist culture where there were just all kinds of views all over the place. I mean, I've known anarcho-royalists. I mean, maybe it's a little tongue-in-cheek. And there's anarcho-socialists, anarcho-communists, anarcho-individualists who sometimes are at war with each other. Let a thousand flowers bloom. There's just room for whatever kind of combination, like just try stuff out. The elitist thing, I think, is important, and it's something that, talking about prog politically, so to speak, it's unavoidable. You come back to it again and again, and it's come up again and again here. I have a lot of views on that, which we can talk about or not, but a slight oversimplification, but one that I believe is it's kind of like a classic American anti-intellectual thing where, you look at Mr. Fancy Pants over there speaking French or whatever it is. There's a certain kind of anti-intellectualism. And one problem I had with punk is a tremendous, complex, involved topic, but at least the American, the variant of punk that I saw, and I'm old enough here in New York, it was pretty reactionary in a lot of ways. And calling prog or anything like prog elitist, there's just a certain kind of reactionary, anti-intellectual angle to that. And that's, I always had like I'm just trying to do something different here, man. Like I'm going to introduce a fourth chord into this song instead of just three chords. Give me a break. So I think that the elitist thing is really fraught, and I recoil a little bit when I hear. You don't hear it so much anymore, maybe, but you heard it all the time at a certain time, and I think it's kind of a reactionary, anti-intellectual view in a lot of ways.
Right. Don't harsh my mellow. I'm going to resolve this chord progression on the flat fifth.
Right.
There's obviously a normativity to it. If you say that there's something elitist or problematic about putting that fourth weird chord in or whatsoever you're interested in doing with your music, you're establishing a norm and saying that people should play within the confines of that norm, or else they will accuse you of essentially accusing them of being inferior intellectually, creatively, what have you.
Well, maybe one thing I'll just say quick is we have to then make an account of Rush in Rio. Like, how was that so popular? I mean, Brazil is not a predominantly white culture. And I mean, I'm going to pick on Rush here again. Probably the one prog band to whose concerts I've been to most. Yeah, I mean, there are women there. There's families there. There's just Rush families. I was telling Emma when we were preparing this episode, one of the most wholesome interactions I've ever seen in my life was just a dad and his son. It was during the Serpents and Arrows tour, and they're playing all the new stuff. And then, of course, Free Will and whatever else comes on. And the dad and the son are just high-fiving in the most like loving way that you could have ever seen. There has to be a criticism of the criticism too, but I think it still stands. There are ways in which that kind of dude bro behavior, it stinks up the space a little bit. And maybe there are a few knuckleheads there who would rather make it the preserve of white men. But I would say by and large, it's not that.
I did an interview recently on my show with Derek Shulman, a hero of mine. Derek Shulman was the front man of Gentle Giant, one of the very, very, very proggiest bands who I absolutely love. And one thing he brought up was Gentle Giant's music is very complex. I think it's the greatest. And it turns out, and I really wasn't aware of this until I started, well, I read his memoir, which is the reason for the interview. A whole bunch of hip hop bands, a ton of hip hop bands have sampled Gentle Giant. And he was thrilled by that, and for obvious reasons. And he was on the Tonight Show, one of these TV shows with a hip hop group. I'm sorry, I don't remember who it was. And they said, and someone said, wait a minute, you're Derek Shulman from Gentle Giant? Hey, come out here, guys. And everyone came out, and they were like bowing and scraping, like, you're the singer from Gentle Giant. There's all these hip hop musicians. And he was just, couldn't be more thrilled. And I was glad to hear that, because like, why can't non-white people appreciate this music? It's ridiculous. And I should add that at the moment, I think that a lot of more experimental hip hop is actually some of the most adventurous music being done now. And guess what? There's a ton of them are sampling Gentle Giant, and that's great.
Absolutely. And I might be getting this wrong. If I do, perhaps we can edit this out. But one of the more recent bands that is put into the prog category is the Mars Volta. And I'm pretty sure at least some of them are Mexican, and that some of the songs, or at least the titles of the songs, are in Spanish. And just, I mean, perhaps there's something unnecessary and maybe not felicitous about using examples as a way of bearing out the overarching point. That can get you into some dicey territory, but maybe so, maybe not. And
I could also say about the Mars Volta in particular, I don't know if I told you this, Emma, but I actually played many shows alongside their drummer, Thomas Pridgeon, who was black, who was, I think, 2 or 3 years in the band, maybe even shorter than that, but very inclusive, racially speaking, for sure.
There were a ton of Latin American prog groups, even back in the day, like in the 70s and 80s. And I mean, there were, obviously, the centers were England, France, Germany, Italy, but there was no shortage of prog groups in the global South or Spain.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll make a sort of theoretical point here, which is that getting into exemplarity as a way to sort of prove something is, I mean, we know this. Everybody that is in this recording right now, there is not some ineradicable racist or misogynist or homophobic grain to any of this. And we could spend a lot of time going through the cases that make that point for us. But then again, perhaps it is useful to have on the record, because there's a surprising lack of content about prog. Like I've been looking for YouTube videos where people explain and philosophize, and for all of the esoteric interests of prog musicians and fans and the wanderings into philosophy, there's not a lot of philosophizing or intellectualizing content of rock out there.
There isn't, yeah, or way, way, way less than you would expect. It's true. One thing that muddies the water, and I don't want to necessarily get off on this tangent, is the term. Well, I mentioned at the beginning, and we all know the term prog, progressive rock prog. They're vague, and there's no official definition, obviously. And I see the term used all over the place now, which as someone who's does a radio show really makes life difficult for me, because people send me, I'll get emails saying this new prog album by so and so, and by my measure, this is not in any way a prog album. So the term is used very sloppily. I don't know what the heck people mean half the time when they say prog. So that makes it a little difficult to kind of do research, because even a lot of articles, I saw an article just yesterday in some online magazine saying the top prog albums of 2026 or whatever, and with a lot of text about them. And I listened, and I would, of like 6 records mentioned, I would consider one of them a prog album. Now, I'm not calling this guy out and saying, oh, he's a jerk, he doesn't know prog, but it's the water is very muddied, basically, and it's hard to find writing about prog that kind of really hits it. There's been a bunch of good books on it, but yeah, the stuff, a lot of the stuff we're talking about, I haven't really read, like the politics of prog and all this stuff. I just haven't seen much ever, really.
Yeah, I don't know what accounts for it. Maybe there's not enough of an audience for it. I have found a few YouTube channels where it's people holding forth about prog, but it never gets to a certain level of depth. I've not found it very satisfying. Maybe it just exists in a different lane in people's minds. I don't know. I do want to make... Has
it not been consecrated? I mean, punk, holy cow. How many books on punk? Okay, let's take a guess. How many books have been written about punk? Hundreds of thousands. Why is that? We can theorize about it, but it just feels like prog hasn't been kind of consecrated, like it hasn't been considered an acceptable topic to write about among academics and so on, whereas punk is just almost required.
It occurs to me that, I'm thinking about the numerous academics I know who write about hip hop and punk and various genres of very popular music, as well as pop culture more generally. And perhaps the reason that it's been ignored is that it is, by the conditions of its own making, difficult to integrate into popular culture. It's not that prog bands haven't been immensely popular. Everybody knows Genesis and Yes and Pink Floyd, who I think we can put in here as well. But it's still not, so something that I would consider as a genre anywhere near as culturally impactful as our paradigmatic examples of punk and hip hop.
Sure.
And this actually leads me to a question that I wanted to ask you, Dave, that I'm sure you're better positioned to speak to than almost anybody else that I can think of. So prog makes itself marginal. That's sort of the idea. And it's probably at least part of why there's not a lot of good cultural criticism, academic writing, etc. about it. But the mechanisms of discourse have changed significantly since the 70s, when it really first came into existence. We have the internet now. We have the democratization of music production through new technologies. What do you think this means broadly for the production and reception of this kind of music? Or what have you seen? How have the material conditions changing in a broader sense had an impact on prog in any way, shape, or form?
Yikes. I have to think about it. Maybe it's just easier to make the music. In the 70s or even the 80s, it was hard for, your next door band to make this kind of music because they just didn't have the kind of equipment. So I think it's just easier. It's more accessible. It's easier to make. This kind of music was out of reach for most home musicians or independent musicians back in the day, 70s, 80s, maybe even 90s. So I think that I do see, I'm surprised at how much music I find out there for my show. Like, I'm constantly doing research, trying to find music to play on my show. And one place I look is Bandcamp, obviously. I'm kind of shocked at how much unequivocally full-blown prog is out there. So why? I think it's just easier to make the music. You don't need to have 7 keyboards that cost a total of $80,000. It's just easier. It's just easier to produce the stuff. I also think that, on shifting gears a little bit, I think there's less of a stigma. I think that it's really important. I have to at least get in a mention of this, squeeze in a mention of this to this conversation. There was a time when prog was just the uncoolest music in the world, and people weren't clamoring to record prog albums or to put the word prog, paste the word prog on their record. And I think those days are over. And that's a reason. I think now it's just music, which is what it should be. Obviously, it's a difference between pop and hip hop and prog. But there's the kind of prejudices. I think that there was a tremendous prejudice against prog for a long time, and that affected a lot of things. People wouldn't admit that they. I mean, this sounds like a joke, but really, I think this is literally true. People would be shy about admitting that they liked prog bands. Certainly wouldn't rush out to make, no pun intended, rush out to make prog music, that kind of music. And I think that, like, it's kind of safe to come out now. And like the air raid drill is over or something. And a lot of I've never seen, I think it's safer. Disco might have been the only other example where there was just this incredible bias. I mean, disco, there was the whole disco sucks thing. It was kind of ugly, but possibly even more than that, or certainly equal to that, was the bias against prog. It really was just the lamest, uncoolest music. And several things happened, and I think the most important thing is there's just a couple more generations have been born who weren't exposed to these kinds of views, and they just listen to it like anything else. I like this music. I like this. I like this. I like this. I like that. Whereas there was a time when I like this. I like this. Whoops! Wait a minute. That's prog. No. And I think that just with time, these biases against it have just finally disappeared. I know musicians, like really well respected, not prog, electronic musicians or something, really well respected musicians, jazz musicians who said to me, "Oh, I was a big Gentle Giant fan." What? You look at Gentle Giant? It's like just completely coming out of the closet. There was a time when a lot of these people you just couldn't say that. You really, really couldn't say it. And so I think that's part of this whole thing, that it's just music, and it's safe to come out and listen to and play this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I am not of the era where there was this huge stigma, and I think that opened up the playing field for me at a young age. It actually always seemed to me to be just a space of total freedom and experimentation, where in the moment of listening to an album or being at a show, or I'm not nearly technically skilled enough as a musician to play the music myself, but at least have the excitement of prog in my head as I was sitting down to compose something on piano, which is the only instrument I really know how to play. It was a line of flight, basically, from the norm. It felt always like something so irreconcilable with all of the things that I didn't like in society and in life, that I could never try to mold my tastes away from it. And that's kind of not who I am as a person anyway. And I want to tell a little story here that might seem out of left fields, and it's not directly even about Prog, but to maybe drive a big point home. We're getting towards the 1.5 hour mark here. So I don't want to keep you for too long, Dave, but maybe this will seem resonant with the things we've already been discussing. So I've been on a big Mike Patton kick recently. Not a Prog musician. He's been involved with all sorts of different projects, but I don't think it would be fair to call anything he was involved with Prog. The band Mr. Bungle is very, very weird. And in that sense, there's that overlap, just totally experimental, excessive, maybe a little bit indulgent with what they were doing, but they're not a Prog band. However, I have this really vivid memory of hanging out with some of my roommates a long time ago, and we were talking about the song Epic from the band Faith No More, which is, for a while, it was one of Mike Patton's projects. And I think Epic is their most famous song. I think it actually broke through to the mainstream. And one of my roommates, a guy, said, the thing about this song, Epic, is that your girlfriend, like somebody's hypothetical girlfriend. So this was a comment not addressed to me, but your girlfriend is never going to relate to this in the same way that you do. Like she's not going to feel it. And I know we've sort of touched on the gender and demographics issue before, and that's not really actually the full point of where I'm going with this. And it hurts to hear comments like that, because the implication is like you're being denied the fullness of your being when someone's saying, hey, this experience that you've had, I don't actually even believe you're capable of having it for reasons you can't control, whether it's your gender, your race, your age, ability, whatever. But then I took a step back and thought about, what world is this person coming from? What are they assuming to be true about the world? Because he's not a bad guy, whatever. It didn't turn into a thing. It was just kind of whatever. We bring all of these assumptions to bear on how we think other people think, how we think things should be. The assumption that this is a type of music that doesn't represent a norm, that can't be ever considered down to earth or like sort of worldly and earthy. It's like, okay, well then what kind of world and what kind of earth are we living in? That's the big question. What kind of world and earth do we live in where...
The problem is with the world and the earth, not the music. Yeah,
right. What about a world where this could be considered like the folk music, whatever, the music of the people? That's the kind of world that I want to live in. And that's where I see this coming into conversation with so many other things. What I wish people spoke about more, not because of anything intrinsic to Prog per se, but because it's a bigger conversation about art and culture and politics and society and what we think politics, culture, society actually means. And yeah, it's why I think all of this is important. Mm-hmm. So I'll end it there.
So totally agree. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Don't impose your worldview on me. I mean, just one side note on that is, like in the Baltics, certain parts of the world, playing in 9/8 time or 17/8 time, these bizarre time signatures, that's just what people do. So just as one data point there, I mean, that's really significant. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a particular. It's a view. It's an ideology that this is a standard way music should be played, and anything else is kind of esoteric and weird and out of reach of most people, because that esoteric, out of reach thing is completely normal in the Baltics.
Right, or that a six-string guitar somehow represents a kind of earthiness or realness, but a Moog analog synthesizer or a piano is somehow more abstracted, maybe from sort of down-to-earth experience. Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by all of these questions at the interface of aesthetics and politics. we don't want to keep you for too long. So maybe as we get towards the end here, is there anything that you want to plug or talk about what you're working on right now? I know you play with bands and you might have shows coming up.
Yeah, I don't want to spend too much time plugging my stuff. I play mainly in two groups. One is called Emergency Group, which is kind of jazz fusion. I don't know what it is. I think we're really good. We play around. We have music available, a lot of music available on Bandcamp. People can check that out. Another band I play with is called Time Trout, which is, I also don't know how to describe, somewhere between free jazz and weird funk and spoken word. Viv Corringham, the singer, is a brilliant improviser. And in Time Trout, we play a lot of stuff in really odd time signatures, and it goes over really, if I say so myself, it goes over really well. I've never seen a problem. We play these grooves in 11 or 13 or whatever, and I've never seen anyone have a problem with that stuff. Anyway, that's Time Trout. The other thing is I have a book that just came out, a book of my photos. It's called Elevated Landscapes. If people just Google me, Dave Mandl, Elevated Landscapes, they'll probably find it. Or you mentioned our website earlier, which is David Mandl, MANDL.com. You can read about my photo book and all this other stuff.
We'll put all the links in the show notes.
Well, Dave, thank you so much for joining us. And yes, we'll absolutely ask you for links to things to put into the show notes and make sure that our listeners have access to them. This has been a really fantastic conversation.